The microphone felt cold against Marvin's lips. 15,000 people waited in the darkness beyond the stage lights, their faces blurred into a single expectant mass. The opening chords of "What's Going On" filled the arena, but Marvin's throat had closed. He opened his mouth and nothing came. Not even air. The silence stretched between his lips and the microphone, a void that seemed to expand with each passing second. Behind him, the bass line pulsed with mechanical precision. The drums held their steady rhythm. But Marvin stood frozen, his hand gripping the microphone stand like it was the only thing anchoring him to reality. His knuckles had gone white from the pressure, and he could feel sweat beginning to form on his forehead, despite the arena's cool air. In that moment, as 15,000 people waited for his voice to join the familiar melody, Marvin realized something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He had forgotten who he was supposed to be. More terrifying still, he wasn't sure if that person had ever existed at all. This was Detroit, November 1973, the same city where Marvin had built his career, where Berry Gordy had discovered him and transformed him into the Prince of Soul, where thousands of hours in the studio had created the smooth, romantic image that sold millions of records. The Cobo Arena was packed to capacity, filled with fans who had waited months for tickets, who had dressed in their finest clothes for a chance to see the man whose voice had soundtracked their love affairs and heartbreaks. But standing on that stage, bathed in hot white light that made him feel exposed and naked, Marvin felt like a stranger in his own skin. The person the audience had come to see, the confident performer who could seduce a crowd with a whisper, didn't exist anymore. Maybe he never had. Maybe it had all been an elaborate fiction, a character so carefully constructed that even Marvin had forgotten he was acting. The seconds stretched into an eternity. Marvin could hear individual voices from the crowd calling his name, could see the confusion starting to ripple through the front rows. Women who had been swaying to the music began to look at each other with concern. Men who had brought their dates shifted nervously. The band members exchanged glances, unsure whether to keep playing or stop. Marvin's chest felt tight, as if someone had wrapped steel cables around his ribs. His vision began to blur around the edges, the faces in the crowd becoming abstract shapes that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. He could feel his heart hammering against his chest wall, so loud that he was certain the front row could hear it through the sound system. But still, he couldn't move, couldn't sing, couldn't even pretend to be the man everyone expected. In the months leading up to this concert, Marvin had been fighting a war against himself that nobody understood. On the surface, everything looked perfect. What's Going On had been a massive success, proving that soul music could address serious subjects. Critics praised it as revolutionary. Audiences embraced it as necessary. But for Marvin, the success felt hollow, disconnected from who he actually was when the recording lights went off. The pressure had been building for years. Every time he stepped on stage, he felt like he was putting on a costume that grew heavier with each performance, becoming a character named Marvin Gaye, who sang about love and healing while the real Marvin felt empty inside. The smooth, romantic image that Motown had crafted was a prison built from platinum records and magazine covers, and each performance made the bar stronger. The transformation had been gradual. In the early days, performing had felt natural, an extension of who he was rather than a role he had to play. But success had brought expectations, and expectations had brought pressure. And pressure had slowly squeezed the authenticity out of every song until he felt like a musician covering his own music. Backstage before the show, Marvin had sat alone in his dressing room for over an hour, staring at himself in the mirror surrounded by bright Hollywood bulbs. He had tried to find the person everyone expected him to be, searching his own face for traces of the confident performer who could command a stage with a gesture. The face looking back was familiar but foreign, like seeing an old photograph of someone you used to know but could no longer remember clearly. He had practiced his stage movements in that small room, rehearsed his between-song banter that was supposed to sound spontaneous, but had been carefully scripted, prepared to deliver the performance that would make the audience happy. He had run through the set list in his head, visualizing each song, each transition, each moment where he would need to summon the charm and charisma that had made him famous. But when he reached for that confident, charismatic performer, he found nothing there. It was like trying to grab smoke with his bare hands. The person he needed to become had somehow disappeared, leaving only a frightened man in an expensive suit who had forgotten how to be anyone other than himself. The anxiety had started small, a flutter in his chest during the opening song that he had initially dismissed as pre-show nerves. But the flutter had grown into a tremor, and the tremor had become a shake, and now his entire body felt like it was vibrating at a frequency that threatened to tear him apart from the inside. A moment of uncertainty about the lyrics to songs he had written himself had evolved into a complete disconnection from his own material. Standing there on stage, looking out at thousands of faces turned toward him, like flowers following the sun, Marvin felt like a fraud who had somehow convinced the world he was something he wasn't. Every song felt like a lie he was telling. Every note felt like a deception he was perpetrating on people who trusted him to be genuine. The worst part was that he could remember a time when performing had felt like coming home, when stepping onto a stage had been the most natural thing in the world. But that memory felt like it belonged to someone else, another man who had worn his face and lived his life but had somehow vanished. Now, standing in front of 15,000 people who had paid good money to see Marvin Gaye perform, he understood that he couldn't pretend anymore. The gap between the person he was supposed to be and the person he actually was had become too wide to bridge. He was exhausted from trying to be someone else, tired of carrying a mask that grew heavier every day. The band had stopped playing. The arena fell into an uncomfortable silence that seemed to press down on everyone present. 15,000 people held their breath, waiting for an explanation that would never come, hoping for a recovery that wasn't going to happen. Some thought it was part of the show, an artistic choice that would soon make sense. Others began to worry that something was genuinely wrong. Marvin slowly pulled the microphone from its stand, his movements deliberate and measured. He looked out at the sea of faces, trying to see individual people rather than an anonymous mass. His voice, when it finally came, was barely audible, even amplified by the sound system. "I'm sorry," he said, each word carefully enunciated, heavy with a sadness that seemed to fill the entire arena. "I can't do this tonight." Then he set the microphone down on the stage floor, with the gentleness of someone placing flowers on a grave, turned his back on 15,000 people, and walked off stage. The walk to the dressing room felt like walking through water, each step requiring tremendous effort. Behind him, he could hear the confused murmur of the crowd, voices rising as people tried to understand what they had witnessed. Stage managers rushed past him in the corridors, trying to figure out what to do next, whether there was some way to salvage the evening. But Marvin kept walking, moving through the backstage corridors like a ghost haunting his own life, detached from the chaos he had created. Security guards who had been hired to protect him now looked at him with concern and confusion, unsure whether he was having some kind of breakdown or whether this was an elaborate artistic statement. The dressing room felt like a sanctuary when he finally reached it, a small space insulated from the demands and expectations of the outside world. He locked the door behind him and sat down heavily in the chair facing the mirror, his legs suddenly too weak to support his weight. The person staring back at him looked hollow, drained of color and life. For the first time in years, Marvin felt like he was seeing himself clearly. Not the smooth performer, not the romantic crooner, not the socially conscious artist, but the broken, frightened man underneath all those carefully constructed personas. The man who had never learned how to be comfortable in his own skin, who had spent his entire career trying to become someone worthy of the attention he received. The makeup that had been applied hours earlier to make him camera-ready now looked garish and artificial under the harsh dressing room lights. The expensive suit that had been tailored to make him look powerful and confident felt like a costume for a play he no longer wanted to perform in. Even his hair, carefully styled to project sophistication, felt like a lie. The phone on the dressing room table started ringing, its shrill tone cutting through the silence. Marvin knew without answering that it would be Barry Gordy, demanding an explanation, calculating the financial loss, already planning damage control. There would be anger, disappointment, lectures about professionalism and responsibility, reminders about contracts and obligations. But Marvin couldn't answer. He couldn't face the disappointment, The inevitable conversation about what this meant for future bookings, the questions about his mental state. Instead, he sat in silence, listening to his own breathing, trying to remember the last time he had felt real, the last time he had been able to look in a mirror without seeing a stranger. The truth was that Marvin had been running from himself for so long that he had forgotten how to stop. Every performance had been an escape, every song a way to avoid dealing with the pain that lived inside him. Music had become a drug that temporarily relieved his symptoms, but never addressed the underlying disease. But tonight, on that stage, the medication had stopped working. There was nowhere left to run. Outside the dressing room, he could hear voices discussing what to tell the audience, how to handle the media, whether to cancel the rest of the tour. Publicists and managers would spend the evening crafting explanations that protected everyone's interests while revealing nothing true about what had actually happened. But Marvin felt detached from all of it, as if he was listening to people talk about someone else's life. The machinery of the music industry would keep turning without him, and maybe that was for the best. Maybe he had never belonged in that machine in the first place. The worst part wasn't the embarrassment or the professional consequences. The worst part was the relief he felt. For the first time in years, Marvin had been honest about something. He couldn't perform tonight because he didn't know how to be the person everyone wanted him to be. That honesty, as terrifying as it was, felt like the first real thing that had happened to him in years. Hours later, when the arena had emptied and the phones had stopped ringing, Marvin was still sitting in that chair, staring at his reflection. He understood that something fundamental had changed. He couldn't pretend anymore that the person on the records was the same as the person in the mirror. The mask had finally slipped, and everyone had seen what was underneath. Nothing. The incident made headlines, but not the kind that celebrated artistic achievement. Radio DJs speculated about drug problems, nervous breakdowns, prima donna behavior. Nobody understood that what they had witnessed wasn't a breakdown, but a breakthrough. Marvin had finally admitted publicly that he didn't know how to be himself. In the weeks that followed, Marvin retreated from public view. He canceled the rest of the tour, ignored calls from executives, and spent most of his time alone in his house. Friends and family who visited found a man who seemed to be slowly disappearing, becoming more transparent with each passing day. The stage fright that had paralyzed him that night never really went away. Even years later, when Marvin eventually returned to performing, he approached each concert with dread and necessity. The joy he had once found in connecting with an audience was gone, replaced by constant anxiety about whether he could make it through the show without falling apart again. Every performance became a test he wasn't sure he could pass. Marvin would stand in the wings before going on stage, his hands shaking, his heart racing, reliving that moment when his voice had failed him. Sometimes he made it through entire concerts, but even on those nights he felt like a fraud, like someone impersonating a person who no longer existed. The incident changed how Marvin related to his own music. Songs that had once felt natural now seemed like scripts he had to memorize. When he listened to his older recordings, he heard a stranger's voice, someone who had been confident in ways that now seemed impossible. The loneliness that had always been part of Marvin's life deepened after that night in Detroit. He had shown 15,000 people his most vulnerable moment, his complete inability to be who they needed him to be. That level of public failure created a shame that followed him everywhere. In interviews, when reporters asked about that night, Marvin would give vague answers about being tired or having technical problems. He never explained what had really happened, how completely he had lost himself in that moment. The truth was too raw for public consumption. People wanted their performers to be larger than life, not broken and uncertain. The music industry moved on, as it always does. Other artists filled the void left by Marvin's canceled tour. But for Marvin, time seemed to have stopped in that moment when his voice disappeared. He carried that silence with him for the rest of his career, a reminder that the person everyone thought they knew was just an illusion. Years later, Marvin would record some of his most beautiful and honest work, songs that seemed to come from deep understanding about human frailty. But he never again experienced the confident joy of his early career, the feeling that he belonged on stage, that performing was a natural expression of who he was. The man who walked off that stage in Detroit was different from the one who had walked on. Something essential had been lost that night. some fundamental belief in his own ability to be the person others needed him to be. In its place was a harder, more honest understanding of what it meant to be human. Fragile, uncertain, and sometimes unable to carry the weight of other people's expectations. That night, Marvin Gaye learned that authenticity comes with a price. To be real means to admit that you don't always have answers, that you can't always be strong, that sometimes the best thing you can do is walk away before you break completely. It was a lesson that would define the rest of his life and his music until the very end.